After a month repairing an industrial engine line in France on direct orders from CEO Vanessa Blackthorne, single father Nolan Reed drove home through a November rain. The GPS said he had arrived, but what his headlights found was not his house. Only churned mud, shattered brick, and a project sign bearing the Blackthorne name. City records listed him as the willing seller. The signature was not his. He did not call the police. He found a scorched house key in the debris, pulled a phone from the bottom of his toolbox, and dialed a number with no saved name. 3 sentences. A silence. Then the voice said, "I'll be there. If you believe greed always leaves a trail, stay with the call that made the Blackthorne empire tremble." Blackthorne Dynamics had not spent 3 decades becoming one of the most respected names in industrial and aerospace engineering by losing contracts, and the prospect of watching a $900 million deal collapse in front of a French partner was something Vanessa Blackthorne had spent 3 sleepless weeks trying to prevent through every channel available to a CEO, who still believed that problems could be solved if you applied enough intelligence and enough staff. 3 engineering teams had traveled to Lann, returned with contradictory diagnoses, and produced reports that made the French side more skeptical with each visit, not less, until the deadline was effectively unmovable, and the credibility of everyone who had been sent was beginning to reflect on the company behind them. It was Conrad Wexler, the chief operating officer, who eventually introduced Nolan Reed's name during a strategy session, doing so with the studied nonchalance of a man who had been waiting for the right moment to make a suggestion that served 2 purposes simultaneously. Nolan was a senior mechanical systems engineer who had spent 14 years at Blackthorne identifying problems that teams of better credentialed colleagues had given up on. A man who could hear a bearing defect before the instruments confirmed it, who had quietly salvaged more than a few expensive contracts without once demanding public recognition, and who operated with such self-contained consistency that most people outside his direct chain of command had only the vaguest understanding of what he actually did. Conrad had spent considerable effort over those 14 years, ensuring Nolan remained on domestic assignments, citing costs and scheduling conflicts whenever international work arose. And Vanessa had accepted those explanations without examining them closely, which was precisely why Nolan was genuinely unsettled when she called him into her office on a Tuesday afternoon and asked him to be on a plane to Lyon by Thursday. He agreed because the work was real, and because he was not the kind of man who calculated the political dimensions of doing his job, but the meeting did not end cleanly. Conrad appeared at the conclusion, holding a stack of authorization forms that he described as standard administrative instruments, a limited power of attorney allowing the company to manage correspondence and routine matters during Nolan's absence, and the ease with which Conrad slid them across the desk carried a particular kind of pressure that was not quite coercion but was also not quite neutral. Nolan read the actual language carefully, found it considerably broader than routine in ways a careful person would notice, and pushed the forms back without signing, saying he would handle his own mail and asking only that the company keep his utilities on auto-pay, a compromise Conrad accepted with a smile that cost him nothing and revealed nothing. 2 days before departure, on the familiar drive home from the office, Nolan noticed survey stakes in the soft earth along the edge of his property. Orange-tipped metal rods positioned with a precision that suggested something more deliberate than utility maintenance. And when he called the city planning office the following morning, a man named Grant Hollowell assured him with practiced ease that the stakes were part of a routine drainage survey and would be removed within the week. Vanessa met him briefly at the departure gate and promised that when he returned, she would formally recommend him for a directorship. The kind of recognition he had quietly stopped expecting and now received with more wariness than gratitude. though he thanked her without showing either. He picked up his bag and walked toward the terminal without looking back, and so he did not see Conrad standing at the tall window behind him, phone already out, watching the runway with the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for a specific sequence to begin. He did not see the message Conrad sent before the plane cleared the field. He did not see the Blackthorn survey van that rolled to a stop in front of his house less than an hour later, engine running in the dark, waiting for a signal that had already been sent. The problem in Lyon turned out to be nothing any of the three previous engineering teams would have found, because all of them had been examining hardware, and the problem lived in the software, specifically in the fuel valve sequencing protocol, where a timing drift of less than 3 milliseconds had been accumulating undetected across thousands of cycles until it created a pressure irregularity that the physical components had been absorbing silently and imperfectly for nearly a year. Nolan discovered it not by running standard diagnostics, but by sitting alone in the test bay late on his second night, listening to the engine run in the dark the way a doctor listens to a chest. And by the third morning, he had identified the deviation with enough precision that the French engineering lead, a careful, skeptical man named Bertrand, who had been openly dismissive of Americans sent to fix French problems, stopped arguing and started taking notes. The repair required 9 days of focused recalibration, and in the weeks that followed, Nolan worked alongside the local team in a way that required no translation, because the language of tolerances and load tables and failure thresholds is neither French nor English, but simply correct or incorrect, and Nolan had always been entirely at home in it. When the final test run cleared every benchmark, Bertrand asked Nolan to take lead credit on the final report, and Nolan declined, requesting instead that the names of the Lyon technicians appear at the top of the documentation, a gesture the French partner later described to Vanessa as worth more than any contractual clause she had ever drafted. Back in the United States, while Nolan spent his evenings in a spare rented room reviewing pressure data no one had previously cross-referenced, Conrad Wexler was moving through a very different set of documents with very different intentions, and the machinery he had built over months was now operating exactly as designed. A city planning specialist named Grant Hollowell had been quietly cooperative throughout, and on a Tuesday night 3 weeks into Nolan's absence, a property transfer cleared the municipal records system listing Nolan as the voluntary seller of his lot at $640,000. Money routed not to any account Nolan owned but to a paper trust entity, created and controlled through a chain of shell arrangements that Conrad had spent months constructing, invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. The supporting inspection report, signed by Grant and citing severe foundational instability, named no independent structural engineer because none had ever visited the property, and the language had been drafted to satisfy the automated review the city used for expedited demolition permits rather than to survive the scrutiny of an actual engineer. Mason Pike, who managed the demolition crew, received the work order and the address without the surrounding context, began scheduling equipment and personnel. But when he reviewed the paperwork closely enough to match signing dates against the public calendar, he found that the timestamp on Nolan's alleged transfer signature corresponded to an afternoon when any reasonable search would have placed Nolan inside a secured French testing facility with no external communication access. He brought this discrepancy to Conrad, who looked at him without a change of expression and said that Mason was being paid to clear a site, not audit a title chain. Nolan called his daughter Sadie that same week from the rented room on a Saturday evening, and the conversation moved in the easy, slightly melancholy direction that conversations between a parent and a grown child take when there is still real warmth between them but not quite enough time to say everything. He told her that when he came home he was going to clear out the back room, the one that had been her mother's workspace for years, and repaint it the color she had always wanted. Sadie laughed and said she wanted to redesign it entirely, that she had been sketching ideas in her architecture studio that would suit the light in that room perfectly. And Nolan said she could do whatever she wanted with it as long as the front porch stayed exactly where it was. Neither of them knew and could not have known that the porch and the room and the oak tree beside the front walk were 9 days from ceasing to exist. Nolan landed at 9:30 on a Thursday evening, rented a car at the airport, and drove the 40 minutes home through rain that had been falling since morning and showed no sign of stopping, his headlights pressing the wet road in a way that felt less like driving than like traveling through something that had not decided yet whether it would let him pass. The navigation app announced his arrival when he turned onto his street, and for a moment he thought he had misread the exit, because what the headlights found on the lot where his house had stood was not a house, or even a ruin of one, but a flat expanse of clay-heavy mud broken by tire tracks and bordered by the kind of rough, sorted debris that accumulates not from a storm but from organized, methodical demolition carried out by people who knew exactly what they were doing. He stopped the car in the road and sat with the engine running until the rain turned the windshield opaque, and then he got out and walked to the edge of what had been his yard and stood in the mud looking at nothing in particular. The oak tree beside the front porch was still there, stripped by the late season and solitary in the way that trees become when everything built around them is removed, and it was the only landmark he could use to confirm that he had not made a wrong turn, that this specific rectangle of churned earth was in fact the ground where he had lived for 11 years, where he had carried his daughter through the front door when she was an infant, where his wife had spent her final months near the window that had faced the garden. A neighbor named Walter, a retired man whose habit of monitoring the street from his front window had once mildly irritated Nolan and now seemed like an extraordinary piece of luck, came outside with an umbrella and explained what he had observed the previous week, which was a large crew arriving with heavy equipment, closing the street for 2 full days, and taking the house apart in sections before removing everything in trucks bearing the Blackthorn name on their panels, with the crew supervisor telling anyone who asked that the owner had sold voluntarily and relocated to Europe. Nolan walked into the lot and found the scorched house key near where the front steps had been, and beside it, a bent section of picture frame that had somehow survived the clearing, still holding a fragment of a photograph. Just his wife's hands resting on the kitchen table he had built himself, the rest of her cut away, as if the demolition had known exactly where to stop. He drove to the city's after-hours permit window, obtained copies of the transfer documentation from a clerk who did not look at him, and in the parking lot under a fluorescent light, read through a signature that was close enough to his own to be convincing from a distance and wrong enough to be indefensible up close. The date on the document was worse than the signature. It placed the signing on a Wednesday afternoon when Nolan had been deep inside Bertrand's sealed test bay, a facility with continuous camera coverage, biometric entry logging, and a strict policy of confiscating all external communication devices at the door. He looked at the date the way he looked at structural data that didn't fit, not with anger, because anger is an inefficient diagnostic approach, but with the focused, particular attention of a man who has just found exactly where the sequence broke down and understands what comes next. The uniformed officer he flagged down near the permit window listened politely, checked the city records on his phone, told Nolan the paperwork appeared to be in order, and suggested he contact a civil attorney in the morning. Nolan thanked him, returned to the rental car, and sat in the dark long enough to think clearly about what he was dealing with. The forged signature, the invalid date, the number on the project sign, which identified a state-subsidized development that would be subject to a specific class of regulatory oversight, and the property itself, which had a legal history that most people involved in this transaction would not have thought to check. He reached into his toolbox, removed the old phone he kept charged for reasons he had never previously needed to explain, and dialed a number he had memorized 8 years ago and never used. When the line connected, he said, "Governor Caldwell, I'm sorry to call at this hour. They've demolished the property covered under the foundry agreement." A silence followed, measured and deliberate, and then Everett Caldwell's voice came back steady and unhurried. "Did you sign the transfer?" Nolan said he had not. Caldwell said, "Don't sign anything. Don't accept any payment. Don't leave the county." By the time Nolan put the phone away, Everett was already placing a second call to Rebecca Sloan, a call that ended with a single instruction: freeze all Crown Line permits before sunrise. By 7 the following morning, the lot on Nolan Street had become a complicated scene. A state inspector's vehicle parked near the project sign, 2 Blackthorn Company cars in the road, a television news crew that had picked up the permit freeze on the municipal scanner and arrived with the alert, focused energy of people who understand they have found something real, and Rebecca Sloan herself standing at the property line in a gray overcoat with a clipboard, moving with the brisk, preoccupied efficiency of someone who treats conversation as a tool of record rather than a form of social interaction. Vanessa Blackthorn arrived 20 minutes after her communications director sent a message containing the words "state investigation" and "frozen permits" in the same sentence, which was what it took to pull her from a breakfast meeting and put her in a car without a complete briefing, arriving at the site expecting a misunderstanding of the administrative variety, the kind that a reasonable exchange between responsible adults and a clarifying document could resolve before the market opened. What she found instead was Nolan Reed standing on a piece of mud that had been his home with his hands in his coat pockets, and the expression of a man who has already finished being surprised and has moved on to something colder and more deliberate. And whatever opening remark Vanessa had prepared did not survive contact with that expression. She asked him to explain. He handed her the transfer documents and waited. She read through them with the rapid, selective focus of a woman who reads contracts the way engineers read specifications, looking for the variance, not the language, and she stopped at the 3rd page, where her own authorization code appeared in the approval block, embedded in a batch of land acquisition documents that Conrad had placed before her 6 weeks ago during a board preparation session. Is described as consolidated corridor approvals for the Crown Line development. All parties consented. She had signed the batch because Conrad had said every affected owner had agreed, because she had a presentation in 40 minutes, and because she was in that particular moment the kind of person who trusted a summary more than the file it summarized, which had never before cost her anything she could see. Nolan watched her recognize this and did not soften it. He asked, quietly and without heat, whether she had read the names of the people whose homes were in the package before she signed. Vanessa could not answer that, and the silence where an answer should have been was its own kind of statement. Conrad arrived within the half-hour, moving through the scene with composed authority, accompanied by 2 attorneys and a leather folder announcing that Nolan had accepted the terms of sale, received fair value, and was now attempting to extract additional consideration by misrepresenting an agreement he had himself requested, and he produced a printed email chain in which a version of Nolan appeared to have agreed to the entire transaction. Nolan examined the address header on the chain and pointed out to Rebecca that the sender domain was missing a single letter, a transposition invisible to anyone reading at pace, but sufficient to establish that the account had never belonged to him. And in the fraction of a second between that observation and the next sentence, Something shifted behind Conrad's composed expression that the attorneys standing beside him were not trained to notice, but that Nolan was. Rebecca asked everyone to step back from the property line and announced the site was under forensic review. She noted in her initial walkthrough that the foundation excavation had gone substantially deeper than the demolition order required, particularly at the eastern end of the lot, in a pattern that corresponded to no architectural or drainage rationale present in any document Conrad's office had submitted to the city. Vanessa offered Nolan a hotel and transportation while the matter was sorted, and Nolan looked at her for a moment before answering with words that were not angry but were precise, in the way a technical specification is precise. You can't demolish someone's home and then hand him a hotel room like it's an upgrade on a canceled flight. Vanessa did not reply, because there was nothing adequate to say to that, and it was the first time in her professional life that a consequence had been stated to her, not as a threat but as a simple description of what she had already done to a specific human being whose name she had not read. Rebecca flagged her team toward the east end of the lot, where the over-excavation was deepest, and in the interior of the cleared demolition records, she found a handwritten instruction attached to the work order that read, "Recover all materials from East Workshop section. Do not include in asset inventory." The Eastern Workshop had been the most important room in Nolan's house, in a way that appeared on no property record, and would never have occurred to anyone who thought of the structure only as a real estate transaction, because it was the room where, in the years before he joined Blackthorn Dynamics, Nolan had developed the core architecture of what he called the Reed failsafe, a fuel distribution sequencing system that used predictive load balancing to prevent cascade failures in high-pressure industrial environments, the kind of failure that could disable an entire regional energy grid rather than a single facility, and that had been developed during a period of state-funded research under a program called the Foundry Initiative, which meant the intellectual property had a documented public interest history as well as a private ownership record. He had brought the technology to Blackthorn under a licensing arrangement negotiated directly with the company's founder, August Blackthorn, granting the company the right to use, develop, and commercially deploy the system for a defined term, while the original design documentation remained under Nolan's custodianship in the Eastern Workshop, a condition August had insisted on and that the licensing agreement stated in clear, unambiguous language. The arrangement had worked quietly and profitably for years, the technology eventually becoming so embedded in Blackthorn's product line that the company had begun representing it in investor materials as proprietary, owned outright, developed internally, a signature asset with no external obligation attached. And that representation was not accurate because the licensing term had expired 2 years earlier, and Blackthorn had never sought renewal, a fact Conrad had been aware of and had actively concealed from the board. When Vanessa returned to the office after the confrontation at the lot and pulled the original technology agreement from the legal archive, a process requiring 3 requests and 2 department heads before the physical file surfaced, she found language that was not ambiguous in any direction. The rights had reverted to Nolan at expiration, and every commercial filing Blackthorn had made in the past 2 years, citing the Reed failsafe as company-owned intellectual property, was built on a classification that could not survive regulatory scrutiny. If the original documentation in the Eastern Workshop had survived, and if it could be compared against what Blackthorn had filed with the patent authorities, the exposure was not merely financial but structural. The kind of liability that rewrites a company's valuation in a single audit cycle and calls into question everything built on top of it. Conrad had understood this before anyone else in the building, and the demolition of the Eastern Workshop was not a secondary consequence of the land acquisition plan. The land acquisition plan had been constructed around the demolition of the eastern workshop from the beginning, the rest of it infrastructure for getting the one thing done that needed to be done before Nolan came home and found it missing. Nolan told Vanessa what the workshop had contained and what Conrad had been looking for, and then he told her that most of the core documentation had been moved to a fireproof safe 2 years ago, not because he had suspected anything specifically, but because he was an engineer by habit, and engineers did not leave irreplaceable material in a room with aging insulation and single-pane glass in a climate that produced hard winters. The lawyers Blackthorne sent to the inspector's office that afternoon arrived with an offer that had clearly been assembled under pressure but structured with enough precision to suggest it had been prepared in advance of the crisis rather than in response to it. $12 million, a custom residence built to Nolan's specifications, an appointment to Vice President of Engineering, and a joint public statement describing the demolition as a procedural miscommunication, in exchange for Nolan withdrawing his cooperation with the state inquiry and releasing all further claims against the company. He declined it in the parking lot, in front of Vanessa, without pausing in the way a person pauses when they are weighing a number. Sadie had called him that morning, and he had told her the truth, and she had been quiet in the brief, composed way of someone trying not to make a difficult thing harder for the person they love. And she had said one sentence that stayed with him through the rest of the day. Don't let them turn Mom's house into a line in a settlement agreement. When the lawyers asked him to reconsider, Nolan said there was nothing to reconsider, and then he told them there was also a third document they had not accounted for. One signed by someone who was no longer alive, and whose word, even posthumously, carried a specific legal weight they were not prepared for. The document Nolan referred to was an amendment to the original licensing agreement, executed in the final year of August Blackthorne's life, which extended certain protections to Nolan's property, in language that went beyond standard contractual terms. An amendment that had been witnessed, notarized, incorporated by reference into the State Energy Authority's Foundry grant records, and signed by August personally over the documented objection of the company's legal team at the time. Nolan did not have a copy. He believed the only surviving original was in the private family archive that Vanessa maintained at the Blackthorne estate, a collection her grandfather had kept deliberately separate from the corporate filing system because August had not trusted institutional records with obligations he considered personal. Vanessa heard this and was quiet for a moment in the particular way of someone making a decision they know is irreversible, and then she offered to take Nolan there that afternoon. The first time she had ever offered to bring an employee into the family archive, a boundary whose weight was visible in the way she moved through the estate when they arrived, protective and slightly formal about things she had not yet named. The estate was a large, well-maintained property on the outer edge of the city, and the family archive occupied a climate-controlled room in the east wing that Vanessa had not opened since the probate proceedings following August's death. The file drawer corresponding to the Foundry period was not difficult to locate, and what it contained shifted everything they already thought they understood, because the correspondence between August Blackthorne and Nolan's father, a mechanical engineer named Douglas Reed who had worked in the same industrial sector a generation earlier, revealed that the relationship between the two families was older and more consequential than anyone currently at the company knew. In the years when Blackthorne Dynamics had been hemorrhaging capital and one program failure away from insolvency, it was a design series developed by Douglas Reed that had stabilized the company's flagship engine program and attracted the government contract that ultimately saved the business, a debt August had recorded in private letters that were not corporate documents but the correspondence of a man who understood what he owed and intended to formalize it. The amendment was in the third folder, notarized on a Tuesday in March, protecting the Reed property and all associated intellectual work from any compelled acquisition by the company, permanently and without expiration, in language clear enough that neither of them needed to read it twice to understand what it meant. Vanessa recognized that Conrad had removed every reference to this document from the company's internal system. She had checked the archive access logs after the lot confrontation and found that a member of his staff had accessed the foundry records twice in the 14 months preceding the demolition, and saying this aloud required her to accept that her signature and her authority had been the operational vehicle for something she would never have authorized had she been given the information she was entitled to receive. Nolan saw that she understood this genuinely, and it changed the quality of attention he gave her, not into warmth or absolution, but into something more precise. The attention one gives a person who is actually reckoning with their position rather than performing the reckoning for an audience. He said that the authorization failure and the moral failure were separate problems, and she would need to solve them separately. Then Vanessa turned the last page of the folder and went still. The final page, the one carrying the amendment's governing clause, the notary seal, and the witness signatures, had been removed from the binding. The cut was recent, made with something sharp, and the neighboring pages had not yet begun to show the slight warping that paper develops over time when an adjacent sheet is absent. Someone had reached this file before them, had known exactly which page to take and had taken only that, leaving everything else untouched in a way that suggested either professional restraint or the calculation that removing more would be noticed more quickly. The archive logs would confirm within 48 hours that the access had occurred during a 90-minute window in which the estate security cameras had been suspended using a credential belonging to Conrad's executive assistant, who would later state under interview that she had been sent to retrieve research materials and had not been told what she was retrieving or removing. Rebecca Sloan's team traced the credential and confirmed the camera suspension, which established both the access and the removal, but not a chain of custody sufficient to charge Conrad directly with the theft. Not yet, not without the physical page or a witness who had seen what happened to it. The state case was real and developing, but its most critical piece was currently distributed across timestamps, digital logs, and the willingness of people who had been given strong incentives to stay quiet. Nolan went back to the demolition site photographs and spent an hour with them before finding what he had suspected was there. Foundation anchors at the east end of the lot positioned at an angle inconsistent with the structural drawings Conrad had submitted for Crown Line campus, which established that the clearing work had been executed before the architectural plans were finalized, which meant the permits had been issued ahead of the documentation designed to justify them, which was not a clerical gap but a deliberate inversion of a process that existed specifically to prevent this kind of abuse. He drove to the address on the demolition company's registration and found Mason Pike loading equipment behind a warehouse, a broad, deliberate man in his mid-40s who carried the specific expression of someone who had been expecting a conversation he had hoped would not come and was now resigned to having it. Mason said he had a confidentiality agreement and could not discuss an active project. Nolan did not threaten him and did not argue with him. He asked one question, plainly and without pressure. Mason had a crew, men who had driven the machines and operated the equipment. And when the attorneys started assigning liability for a fraudulent demolition order, were those men going to be in a position to explain that they had followed lawful instructions from a licensed operator, or were they going to find that the paperwork chain above them had been designed to terminate in their names? Mason was quiet for a long time, looking at nothing in particular, and then he went inside and returned with a manila envelope and a phone. The envelope held a copy of the field construction log he had maintained privately after noticing the date anomaly. Not the redacted version Conrad's office had submitted to the city, but the original with all entries intact, including the one showing that site work had begun at 6:45 in the morning, roughly 4 hours before the demolition permit was officially issued. The phone contained a short video clip from a security camera mounted on one of the machines, showing Grant Hollowell on the property before any permit existed, speaking near a Blackthorn vehicle whose occupant's face was not visible but whose license plate was, and a section of audio at the end of the clip in which Conrad Wexler's voice, unhurried, precise, unmistakable, instructed Mason to ensure the structure was fully cleared before a specific return flight landed, and to prioritize the eastern section. Rebecca's forensic team reviewed the materials that evening and confirmed the metadata and timestamps had not been altered in any way that could be attributed to editing. Vanessa wanted to submit everything to the state investigation immediately, to move before Conrad could take further action. But Nolan thought this was the wrong sequence. He pointed out that Conrad was about to convene an emergency board session in which he planned to remove Vanessa from the CEO role by accusing her of colluding with Nolan to sabotage a $600 million development. That he had already introduced this narrative to 2 board members and to a financial journalist who had been developing a story for several days, and that if the evidence was released before the session, Conrad would know exactly what had been gathered and could calibrate his sworn testimony accordingly. Whereas if the session proceeded first, Conrad would commit to a complete fabricated account in sworn conditions from which there was no clean retreat. Vanessa asked Nolan, in the quiet before the board session, whether he would ever trust her again in any professional sense after what had occurred. He thought about it with the honesty of a man who does not answer questions he has not actually resolved. He said that trust was not built from apologies. It was built from what a person was willing to lose in order to tell the truth, and that she was about to find out precisely what that cost. He said it without cruelty and without comfort, in the tone of someone describing a road they were genuinely uncertain she would choose to walk. Vanessa walked into the board session the following morning and announced, before Conrad could call the meeting to order, that she intended to provide full cooperation to the state investigation, including sworn testimony. The emergency board session had been formally upgraded to a hearing by the time Rebecca Sloan arrived, with a representative from the state prosecutor's office, both of whom took seats along the wall with the particular stillness of people who had not come to participate in the discussion, but to record it. Conrad had prepared for this version of events in the way he prepared for everything, thoroughly, with redundancy, presenting a sequence in which Nolan had voluntarily entered a sale agreement, accepted consideration through a trust arrangement at his own request, then reversed course upon learning the scale of the development, and manufactured a grievance by leveraging political relationships most people in the room had not previously known he possessed. He produced the email chain, the electronic signature documentation, the trust disbursement records, and a secondary file suggesting that during the Lion assignment, Nolan had withheld certain system configuration parameters from the technical handover, implying that professional leverage had been part of Nolan's conduct from the beginning. The board listened with the careful attentiveness of people who understand that being seen to listen is its own kind of credibility. When Bertrand appeared on the video link, a connection he had agreed to without being told exactly what it would be used for, he described Nolan's conduct in Lion in terms that made Conrad's secondary accusation impossible to sustain in the same room where both accounts coexisted. Nolan then placed Mason's original construction log on the conference table, walked through the timeline from the field entries, and asked Rebecca to address the signature timing. She explained, in the measured and thorough way she addressed all evidence, that the electronic signature certifying Nolan's transfer had been created at 2:17 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, at which time the biometric access records from Bertrand's facility showed that Nolan had checked into a secured testing environment at noon and had not exited before 6 that evening, a facility whose communications policy was documented, whose access logs had been independently requested by the state the previous day, and whose records had not been disputed by anyone in the room. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was the silence that follows not a surprise, but a simple, irrefutable fact that makes a considerable amount of prior testimony retroactively difficult to maintain under oath. Mason entered when Rebecca indicated, placed his field log beside Nolan's documentation, and the audio clip was played from a device in Rebecca's hand. Conrad's voice, giving the order, specifying the timeline, naming the eastern section of the structure, before the full board and the prosecutor's representative simultaneously. Grant Hollowell, seated at the far end of the table and increasingly still for the past 20 minutes, confirmed in a brief, cornered statement that the scheme had existed and had been operationally directed, placing origination entirely with Conrad, which was accurate as far as it went, and which also ended any remaining possibility of the board treating the matter as a misunderstanding. Conrad turned toward Vanessa and pointed out that her authorization code appeared on the acquisition documents, that her approval stamp was on the record, that she could not credibly position herself as uninformed while her credentials sat on the paperwork. Vanessa did not deny it. She said that she had signed a batch of documents she had not individually reviewed, had been told all affected parties had consented, and that her decision to trust that summary rather than verify it was a failure of governance she was accepting publicly and completely. The statement cost her more than it appeared to, and its cost was precisely why Conrad could not use it against her, because she had already spent it herself, in the open, before he could deploy it as a weapon. Everett Caldwell did not appear in person, but his written determination was read into the record. Crown Line campus suspended pending full review. All associated Blackthorn tax incentives frozen. The matter formally referred to the state prosecutor's office. An independent audit of all company land acquisitions over the past 4 years initiated, and Nolan's ownership of the property provisionally restored for the duration of the investigation. Conrad was escorted from the room for a formal interview, and as he passed Nolan in the corridor, he stopped and said that Nolan had just destroyed the company that had sustained him for over a decade. Nolan's answer was quiet and did not require a second sentence. "No, I just stopped letting it run on something stolen." The legal proceedings that followed were not swift because proceedings involving corporate fraud, state regulatory violations, and forged property transfer documents rarely are, but they were steady in the way that well-documented cases tend to be. Each filing supported by the one before it, each piece of testimony consistent with the physical evidence in ways that are very difficult to fabricate after the fact. Conrad was indicted on 6 counts including document fraud, financial misrepresentation, and obstruction of a state investigation, charges his attorneys characterized as an overreach, and that the prosecutor's office declined to reduce. Grant lost his city position, entered a cooperation arrangement, and placed his role in the scheme entirely on the record, including the consulting payments Conrad had routed to him. Payments structured to survive casual review but not a forensic accounting examination, which the audit provided. The state audit found 3 additional land acquisitions in the Crown Line corridor where owner consent documentation was incomplete or subsequently disputed, which expanded the investigation beyond Nolan's lot and removed any remaining possibility of framing the case as an isolated administrative error. Vanessa was asked by the newly restructured board to step back from the CEO role during the reorganization period, a request she did not contest, partly because she had already decided she would accept it, and partly because contesting it would have consumed energy she had committed to spending on the things she had actually decided to do. She sold a portion of her personal equity holdings and used the proceeds to establish a compensation fund for the 3 other property owners whose agreements were under review, offering settlement terms that did not require them to waive future claims, a structure her attorneys argued against and that she required them to include regardless. Blackthorn's stock fell substantially in the weeks following the disclosure. Several development partnerships suspended their involvement pending resolution, and there were weeks when the business press described the company in terms more suited to an autopsy than a profile. Nolan was present for most of this through the reports that reached him, and he was not comfortable being described as the agent of it. But discomfort, as he understood well, was a category separate from responsibility. He organized a meeting with the Workers' Council at Blackthorn's main manufacturing facility, attended by more than 200 employees who had questions about whether their jobs still existed, and he explained his position directly. He had no interest in the company's failure, did not believe the workers who operated its facilities were the authors of its governance problems, and intended to propose a new licensing structure for the Reed failsafe technology, a royalty arrangement that would fund both operational continuity and a technical training program for workers in transition. He did not return to Blackthorn as an employee. He was appointed as an independent safety advisor with a direct reporting line to the new oversight board, a structure unusual enough to require a specific charter amendment which passed without dissent. In place of the $12 million settlement, he asked for 5 things: restoration of his title to the lot, company-funded reconstruction of a home of comparable scale, restoration of the oak tree and the Eastern workshop, a publicly placed marker acknowledging the Reed family's foundational contribution to the technology that had kept Blackthorn solvent, and the establishment of a free technical training center for mechanics and engineers facing career transitions. Every condition was met. When Vanessa signed the final reconstruction agreement, she noted that Nolan had included nothing for himself alone and asked whether that was intentional. He said he had included everything he needed. She looked at the document for a long moment after he said it, and did not ask a follow-up question. 10 months after the demolition order had turned his lot into a field of mud in a November rain, the new house stood finished on the same ground, built to nearly the same footprint by a crew that had been given both the original plans and permission to improve what 11 years had taught Nolan could be made better. It was not a replica, and he had not asked for one because he understood that certain things cannot be reproduced. Not the grain of boards that have seasoned over years, not the quality of morning light through a window positioned by a man long dead, not the sense of familiarity that accumulates only through time and is not available by any other method. What the new house held were the pieces that could be saved. Bricks and timber recovered from the demolition debris had been worked into the living room wall at Sadie's request, left visible and unfinished, a record of discontinuity that was also a record of continuation. The house was different, and Nolan had made his peace with different, and different turned out to be something he could live in. Sadie came back for the opening in person, not over a phone connection, and moved through the rooms with the careful appreciation of someone who understands that things like this are not given back but rebuilt, and that rebuilt is not the same as restored, and that not the same can still mean good. She hung a framed photograph in the room she had redesigned in the style she had been sketching for months. A room that would be hers whenever she came home, and her mother's in every other sense that mattered. and the act of hanging it was not ceremonial but practical and quiet, and entirely sufficient. The Eastern workshop opened as Reed Engineering House on a morning when 14 people attended the first session. Some of them former Blackthorn workers navigating transitions, some of them younger, and carrying the slightly uncertain energy of people beginning something rather than continuing it, and the room filled with the particular focused hum of people who have a problem in front of them and the tools to work on it, which is a sound Nolan had always found more reassuring than any other. Blackthorn Dynamics emerged from its restructuring period smaller, more carefully governed, and without the particular institutional confidence that had once made it easy for one person to operate for years without being examined. Vanessa was reinstated to her executive role after the oversight period concluded, her authority bound by mechanisms she accepted and said publicly were overdue. She arrived at the opening without a driver or a staff member, walked the property alone, and found Nolan in the workshop, in the middle of a conversation about a compressor calibration issue that had nothing to do with anything that had happened over the past year, which was exactly the point. She had brought the scorched house key in a small glass box, recovered from the evidence intake during the final review of materials, and returned to her custody with Rebecca's permission. And she told him it was a reminder that no decision made on paper is only a number. Nolan set the box on the workbench without ceremony and did not say that he had forgiven her completely, because that was not yet the precise truth, and precision had always been his default. He asked if she wanted coffee. She said yes. He turned toward the door and called inside to see if there was still some made, and the men and women in the workshop answered without stopping what they were doing, which was its own kind of answer. When the sun went down, Nolan stood on the front porch watching Sadie through the window as she adjusted the photograph on the wall of the rebuilt room. The house different from what it had been before, but unmistakably his. On the other side of the street, where the Crown Line campus sign had stood for 10 months, there was now a smaller board that read, Reed Engineering House. No progress is worth building on someone else's life. His phone buzzed once. A text from Everett Caldwell. How's the house? Nolan looked at the light in the window, at the outline of his daughter in the room she had made her own from pieces of the past and plans of her own design, and typed back, not the same as before, but finally home. He put the phone in his pocket. The scorched key sat on the workbench inside, its burn marks exactly as they had been the night he pulled it from the mud. Unchanged, unmistakable, the whole story in the palm of a hand.